Hey y'all, I just wanted to make a video about kind of something I really want to start developing and creating, which is the Fursona to Persona pipeline, right? A lot of my journey, this basically comes from kind of understanding my own personal journey with the gym, a lot of reflection and all that stuff, right? And, it was like, what is the learning, like what did I learn from that, right? And like how did I do it, right? Because it's just kind of like, diet, exercise, cardio, all that stuff, right? Been there, done that. There's other content creators that are great with that, right? Great personal trainers, right? um I'm not too good with that right now, just because in my journey I simplified the process for myself to make it as sustainable as possible. So I have a very basic diet. I'll open up and share about that a little bit, right? In future videos, right? But ultimately, right, is like, what can I offer to the gym space in the furry fandom, right? And ultimately, right, is I think we have something untapped that I honestly, I'm not gonna lie, whenever I first created Rhyme, it was a little bit of a cope, right? Self-admittedly, right, it was confidence that I wish that I had. It was like, somebody that I wish I could be, right? It's the anthropomorphized bear of that, right? But ultimately, right, it came from a place of, you know being afraid of who I was, and representing myself, right? Through that, I was able to meet the fandom. I was able to meet the community, right? So I'm like, through a cope, it was so good for me, right? And as I navigated my own personal journey through this, right, I used Ryan again to be able to do that, if that makes sense. Because I'm not gonna lie, I lost myself a little bit, right? That's why we're creating shadow sodas, which is, I don't know, it's a fandom. We do what we want here, but let's bring that back to what we need to talk about, which is enabling, taking characteristics of our characters that we created, right? And I am not in a place to judge of why you created your character, right? But there is a huge influx of muscle furs, muscle characters, right? And I want to tap into that a little bit, because it's like, it's one of those things where it's just like, okay, there's something that comes from there, there's something that derives from there, that you're like, man, I really want to do that. I really like how that looks, which is completely fine and completely valid. But when we're talking about, why did you choose to do muscles, right? Because if you do this, losing my 100 pounds, building a lot of muscle mass, right? If you do this just for physical appearances, you're going to fail every single time, just because it does take time. I started my weight loss journey in 2022. It's 2026. So this is a 4-year journey for me. You get your fundamentals in the get-go, right? Understanding diet, exercise, all that fun stuff, right? But what about the rest? And keeping you consistent and keeping you disciplined, right? And there's a lot of things that I can relate to in the standard journey, right? Just because, you know, discipline, by understanding my mess ups, created maturity, right? That's ultimately, what is pulled out from, more traditional gym spaces, right? But it's just like forced to be able to do that. And as gay men, as queer men, specifically, right, we are told that we are less than, that we do not have those principles, right, just because of our sexuality, right? um I was able to get confidence in my sexuality, and ultimately confidence of who I am, literally through just living heavy ass weight, right? And through that process, it was very lonely and it was unsatisfying because it didn't satiate a need. But then I was like, okay, reflecting, getting into that process there, let's delve into that in terms of like, why did I choose the fandom? Why did the fandom bring so much joy to me? And it's like, I started dissecting elements of my character, right? And I was kind of able to bring me back to the light a little bit, and it was able to just kind of do that. So with that being said, right, is ultimately, how would you approach that? The big things is, getting your fundamentals in order, right? Like understanding, what diet works for you, what exercises work for you, right? Because that's the hardest part. Once you kind of get that stuff dialed in, right, it's just smooth sailing, and it's time. It's just, what do you do in that time? You just keep on going. But then it's just kind of like, okay, maybe creating a character, or taking your character that you already have, and really just understanding that character. Because ultimately, whenever you look at a gym journey, it's very much a story. And, going back to, creativity and masculinity, those things, quote unquote, don't exist or, look down upon. That's why anybody creative, does it, is it, look down a little bit, right? And I'm not saying a lot of people do that, right? But it is looked weird, right? But the weird is what makes us special. And what makes us special is our story. So, with that being said, having characters in the fandom, you can use your character to tell your story and being able to bring that out into you, right? And that gives that freedom, that gives that intellectual freedom there to be able to kind of do what you want. So, if you're like, hey, I just want to look good, well, like, why do you want to look good? Was it through bullying? I was bullied. I was bullied a lot growing up. Was it a lot of instances for just any personal reasons, right? And like, what is that story? Um, maybe work on getting art through that, art of your journey, and just start, linking, your character creation, your character design, and what makes your character special, kind of linking that to there. Um, I think that would be really, really fucking cool is if we started doing that a little bit more, right? And I'm not saying, oh, everybody needs to go to the gym, right? That's not what I'm saying, right? But, ultimately, this does come from already aspects in our fandom, already, in elements of expression. It's just, it hasn't really been connected to the gym, right? And with that, like, any kind of, big changes like that, right? It does take time and it does take support. So with that being said, it'd be really cool, if we start, thinking about that and start supporting each other, then you can kind of start linking the cons together and kind of support each other through that way, right? And you kind of bring elements into your character, literally into your physical body. Maybe start up some support groups, if anybody's interested, or just, meetups or anything like that, and really just kind of start talking about that. Because ultimately that's what I'm doing for my own personal journey, right? My content is going to kind of just be whatever I want. It's unhinged. But, ultimately it is an expression of self. It is expression of how I brought, my character to myself through my body, through my actions, and, content creation and all that stuff, right? It's just there for fun. It's there for performance, right? I think that all that's valid, but you have to be humble through that and understand that, these expressions are elements of character, of your character that you created. So that way you kind of keep that being humble, but also just kind of like showing off your story as well. So that way you can start having elements of inspiration for others, because, my favorite part about my gym journey was when I was at Megaplex, and, I was in my cute little outfits, and, somebody came up to me and was like, oh, you look really good. I wish I can look like you. And I was like, yeah, no, I used to look like this. I just fell in love with this, and, started their gym journey. So, creativity is ultimately what we're aiming for, because that is the purest form of expression, and don't let anybody tell you not to. So with that being said, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.